Thank you so much for coming on the show. Dr. Smaldino is how you say your name?
Yeah, that's right.
Perfect. So you say in The Natural Selection of Bad Science that science is not merely a system free of incentives, that it has forces at work that make people act in certain ways, or there are forces that affect the system. And you say that's leading us to sort of a system of bad science. Could you explain what you mean by that? Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, and I want to just start by saying that it doesn't necessarily have to lead us to a system of bad science. And I think there are some areas in which really good science is being done and good science is being incentivized. But there is enough of a widespread bad incentivizing that I view this, and a lot of my colleagues view this as a real problem. Um, so there are two ways in which incentive shapes behavior. The one is the one I think is more obvious, that there are clear incentives. Scientists are rewarded for publishing, for getting grants, for getting their papers and their work in high impact journals, for getting news coverage, et cetera. And so you can imagine people will strategize, will say, I'm going to strategically change my behavior because I see what's being rewarded and I'm going to do that. And that's a problem. But a more insidious problem that I think fewer people recognize is that even if you don't have that, even if there's enough shaming, or people just have good enough intentions that they're not really doing that. Probably some people are doing it, but maybe it's not that many. If the incentives are still there, then over time, everyone can still have the perfectly good intentions and say, I'm going to do my best, but the people whose best involves doing, let's say, less rigorous work and getting more papers out, doing less rigorous work and overhyping their results, or interpreting it in ways that, let's say, have less integrity, but get the headline. They're going to get rewarded. They're going to get the better jobs. They're going to get more grants. They're going to attract more students. Their students are going to copy their methods, and those methods are going to propagate that lead to worse results, more false positives, more false discoveries, less reproducibility.
Right, and what you're really talking about is sort of an evolutionary force acting upon science. You're saying, look, there's variation in the level of scrupulous behavior, and how we reward that behavior affects how many basically you could think of like children of that professor, or offspring of that professor get produced. And you're saying right now, or in some incentives we're giving, we're rewarding sort of less scrupulous behavior, and those professors get more grants, more funding, and they get more students under them, and those students are copying those results. Am I getting that right, or those methods?
Yeah, so I want to point out that it's not that scientists are rewarded only for publishing papers, but it's a huge part of it. And different fields will vary in the extent to which this is a serious problem, but I think it is widespread. So if you can imagine, we're used to thinking of evolution in terms of acting on genes and on biological species that die and reproduce. But culture also evolves, right? And Darwin laid out, you don't need genes for evolution. You just need three things, right? You need variation in a population. You need the things that vary to be heritable, to be able to be passed down from one individual to another. And you need selection. So that variation matters in the extent to which those traits are passed down. And anything that has those properties is subject to natural selection. And so any cultural trait where there's variation, so scientists vary in their methods, there is heritability in which different methods get passed down. So students have advisors who they learn from, professors who have influence. They spread their methods through their papers, through their seminars, through their lectures, and there's selection. There's a lot more people who get PhDs in the sciences who want jobs than can have them, and so there's a bottleneck, and selection through the bottleneck is non-random, right? And So the question is then, what are the traits that we're selecting for, and what are the traits that we're selecting against?
Correct. I think this is one of my big problems, because one thing you talk about is that any quantifiable metric, once it's being sort of used and people realize that it's being used, let's say it's like getting attention grabbing headlines, it gets corrupted, because then people just focus on, well, I'm just going to do that. And I think this is where there seems to be sort of an intractable problem, because whatever we select for is going to be able to be gamed to some extent. Do you have any ideas or solutions in this sense? Because it is a very real problem that there are too many PhDs, not enough faculty positions, not enough funding. And so it feels like we have to select for something, maybe. And I want to get your thoughts on that. I know you actually are in favor of like a modified lottery funding thing, but I just want to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah. So, well, I'll say, let me just start out by saying the things that can lead to these problems are selecting for individuals who can publish lots and lots of papers in high impact journals and get press coverage and get grants. And on the surface, that doesn't seem like a bad thing, right? We want to hire scientists who are productive, who do a lot of, who actually produce work. We want to hire scientists whose work is impactful, that gets cited a lot, is important enough to be in high impact journals and get press coverage. The issue is that if we use the measure of how many papers, the impact of the journals that are published in, how many grants, right? These are proxies, and proxies can be gamed, right? You're not selecting for productivity per se. You're selecting for a byproduct that might be correlated, you think, with productivity. But if you're only selecting for that thing, for that measure of productivity, and not for productivity in itself, then you're selecting for any methodology or any behaviors that can increase scores on the methodology without actually increasing effort.
Right.
Right?
In other words, we're trying to turn a qualitative metric like productivity into a quantitative one, something like citation numbers, impact factor, number of publications, all of these things, and that those are correlated but not necessarily completely tied together.
Exactly. There's a sort of a famous quote in economics called Goodhart's law, named after somebody named Goodhart, who wrote this in the 70s, who just said, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Right? And I think it's pretty easy to extend this to lots of other domains, the media being one, with clickbait and stuff. We select for the media that gets the most clicks and not the ones that actually does the thing that we most want in our media. But that's another story.
No. I think your sort of agent-based evolution, which we'll get to in 1 second, is a great proxy for a great analogy to a lot of different areas. That's why I thought it was so interesting. But your paper, it didn't just argue these things on paper. You actually tried to set up some simulations of like labs and how people function under incentives. Talk a little bit about that.
Okay, sure. And I do eventually want to come back to solutions, but let's talk about this for a second. Our intuitions are usually bad about complex systems. This is just true of most complex systems and most people. And so that's one thing. And the other is that language is ambiguous. Right? If I say, this is a problem because when such and such a thing happens, this other thing then follows. And you say, well, I interpret what you mean by such and such a thing happens in one way, and somebody else hears it and they interpret it in a different way. And they start thinking through the consequences, and their conclusions might be different. Their logic might be immaculate. But if the way they imagine the words that I say be different, then that leads to conflict or misinterpretation. So I'm a big proponent in general of using formal mathematical and computational modeling to really um, crystallize what we actually mean, what we're talking about. And this is this shouldn't be real. This shouldn't really be a controversial take because all mature scientists use formal models all the time, right? We use models of the planets and for astronomy we use models of bridges in engineering, right? We use models of species in evolution and of cell behavior and of neurons and neuroscience, right? Because we want to we parse down what we know about things and we can formalize them. In the social and behavioral sciences, uh, things are really complicated. So it's actually quite difficult to produce formal models, but it's getting better. And people have been advancing this area, pretty strenuously for, I don't know, some number of decades. Um, so I think that when we make a formal model of something, we say, all right, this is what I'm talking about. I mean this, I don't mean this. Right? These are the assumptions I'm making, so we can be clear. And if you think these assumptions are reasonable, if you think that scientists produce work and their rate of production is related to their effort, and the number of mistakes that they make is also related to their effort. And if I'm selecting on rigor and I'm selecting against being wrong, then methods are going to get better because the ones who are wrong the most often won't succeed and won't pass their methods. But knowing what's right or wrong is actually not that easy, right? The only way we know is to do scientific studies. And if the scientific studies themselves are flawed, then we have a real problem. And if we're selecting on how many papers you can get out purporting or claiming some result instead of how rigorous your results are, and we end up is a large literature of things that don't replicate. Um, and this came to a head about a decade ago, or less, in some of the sciences, in what's now called the reproducibility crisis in some fields, in particular psychology and biomedicine. Um, and what's encouraging is that uh, institutions and organizations and better practices have been proposed and implemented, not universally, but there is an increasing effort to try to make things better. Um, so, my with two of my graduate students, we did a follow-up simulation study to this. Um, in part because we thought, well, changing institutional norms, like selecting for hiring people and promoting people who can publish a lot, these are really hard to change. So the question is, we could say, well, how do we make things better? Oh, we just stop selecting for, people who publish a lot, and we spend more time and effort, hiring people that are really rigorous. And you can do that to some extent, but it's very hard. Scientists are busy. Not everyone is perfectly able to evaluate someone whose work is not in their field, right? If you're doing novel, innovative work, it's not necessarily easy for someone else to know how good it is, especially early. So, we use things like, okay, the ability to get work out as one, hopefully not the only, but as a proxy. So our question was, you know, if we can't change this right away, if this is a hard thing to change, are there other things we can do that can help combat this? And we said, well, there's sometimes called, for better or worse, the open science movement has been promoting things like registered reports where you submit methods and a research plan to a journal for peer review before the actual study is done. Um, and so then the journal sort of agrees if it passes review. If they say these are good methods, they agree to publish the paper regardless of what the results are. And so this is an effort to reduce false discovery, false positives.
And to publish negative results as well, which is a huge
Exactly.
problem.
Yeah. And to publish negative results, which also skews the information content of the literature if you're only publishing. We had an earlier paper on this, that when you have a lot of publication bias and you're only publishing positive results, then you get a skewed view of the likelihood that something is really true. Um, and if you do things to allow peer reviewers to be better. So there's now more of a movement to, if you submit a paper, you also have to submit your data and you have to submit your analysis code so that people can actually check your work in a more thorough
That
way.
seems crazy that wasn't already the case.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's crazy that it wasn't already the case. And now more and more people are like, it's crazy that that wasn't the case. We should really be insisting on this. So our idea was like, okay, if we can make peer review better, and if we can reduce publication bias, well, is that going to be enough to combat this sort of natural selection of bad science? And the answer is no. Right? The simulations show pretty clearly no, it's not enough. It's a good. We should do it. We're in favor of it, but it's not enough.
Yeah.
Incentivizing replication is not enough. Right? We need something to directly combat this selection for publication quantity. And the only thing we found is to have another bottleneck where the selection criteria is different that combats it. And our idea is that funders can play a big role here, because hiring practices at university levels, this is a widespread kind of norms of science in general, norms of academia. These are hard to change. Individual funders can change their policies a lot more quickly. And if they can focus more on rigor enough, then this can actually make a lot of headway in combating sort of selection for poor methods.
Let's continue talking about funding for a second. That's where you came up with the modified funding idea, right? Where you have to reach a certain threshold of rigor, if I'm understanding correctly. And then once you do, you're in a pool, sort of like a lottery pool for receiving that funding. Is that right?
That's right. To be clear, the idea of a modified lottery was not our idea. Other people have proposed this. We were among the first to model it. It's specifically to model its impact on reproducibility and scientific quality. So other people have noted and used. There's some nice game theory modeling showing that a lottery would actually be a really good use of a better use of more efficient use of scientists' time. Right? Because
this is huge. This is a huge component. I know someone in grants administration, and I've also just heard either anecdotally or empirically. There are a lot of different reports for the numbers, but it's something like, I don't know, 20 to 40% of a scientist's time, maybe more than that, I don't know, is grant research writing.
Yeah, so the stats I've heard is about for research-intensive universities in the sciences and in science and engineering, the amount of research time spent on grants is about 20%. In biomedical sciences and soft money jobs where their salaries are paid by grants, it's over 50%.
So for the audience, that just on the basis of trying to get all these grants, you're using up 20 to 50% of your scientist's time. And this is why sort of this lottery idea might be useful, right?
That's right. I mean, to be fair, not all that time is wasted, right? Obviously, it's not wasted if you get the grant, but also, part of it is doing research and fine-tuning your scientific proposals, your hypotheses, how are you going to, your study designs, and that's important. But it's still a ton of time, and a lot of it is just bureaucratic, or just like, how exactly do I write this in the perfect way that some reviewer will rate it as highly as possible so I can compete for this limited pool of money. And so people have proposed that a lottery would get around this. Then all you have to do is pass a threshold. Like, obviously, we don't want to fund crap or crazy crackpot stuff, right? We want to fund things that have a decent chance of succeeding or seem to be well motivated. But past that threshold of like, is this something that we would in theory fund? Once it passes that threshold, the methods seem to be sound, the team seems to be good, the hypothesis seems to be interesting. we'll put it in a lottery. And so what we did was to say, all right, let's model this. Let's just say, to get grants. So we compared this with grants just totally random without a test for rigor. We compared it to a scenario where it was the same. It's the same idea as publishing, that more prestigious labs who publish a lot are the ones most likely to get funded.
Right. Let's back up, because I think we need to focus on that problem real quick. The current system is that, right? Like, explain the current system for people so they understand what's going on.
So there's some variation because funding isn't monolithic. There are many different agencies, both private and governmental, that fund science. So for the governmental, the biggest ones are the NSF, National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, NIH, and the Department of Defense. And then there's lots of private institutions as well, private foundations. And they all have different idiomatic things, but basically the idea is this. Sometimes they'll put out a call saying, we're looking for research in this area. Sometimes they just have a general blanket, like, we have these offices that fund this type of research, so send us a proposal. Scientists get together, they come up with a research idea, they write a proposal. They say, this is what I'm going to do, this is what we're going to do, this is the plan, this is why it's important, this is what we hope to find, this is how much money we're going to need. And then those agencies, they read those proposals. There are program officers that are in charge of this that have some sort of domain expertise. And then they'll often set up a panel of domain experts to review these proposals, and they will score them on a number of criteria. And the ones that get the top scores, the ones that tend to get funded, will usually get funded. Then, actually those scores go back to the program officers and they say, okay, these have got the best scores. Can I justify, this money going to this? But basically the idea is, if you're not in the very, very top scoring grant proposals, you're not going to get funded. And so what is sort of the marginal cost of investing more and more time to get your proposal absolutely perfect, so that every possible reviewer, and you don't know who these reviewers are going to be, right? So you have to just try to think of any objection that anyone is going to have and get it in there and get it sexy and use the right words and not use words that some reviewer might be from a discipline or a tradition that doesn't like that word or something like that. And it's crazy. You spend a ton of time doing this. And at the end of the day, for the sort of people in the top bit, it's basically random whether or not you get right. I mean, people have done the research where they've given the exact same proposals to, a few different sets of grant reviewers, and the scores, like, there's a correlation, but the likelihood, given that, you tend to be in, let's say, the top third of proposals,
yeah,
the likelihood on any given round you're going to get funded and be in that top 5% is basically random.
So your point is, we're wasting a bunch of time sort of optimizing this thing that's mostly random anyways. Let's save a lot of that time by making the threshold sort of rigor and methodology, and just make it what it sort of already is.
Yeah. I mean, there should probably be exceptions for certain things that require continuous funding. But beyond that, yeah, absolutely. And this matters a lot. It matters a lot for, what kind of work gets funded, that we want to make sure that it's not just people who had early successes just by chance, and then they get a grant that allows them to do a bunch of stuff on the basis of them doing that stuff, that then they get more grants, and it spirals. And then the people who were just as good at the beginning, who didn't get that early grant, get left behind forever, right? Because then it's like, oh, well, you haven't gotten a grant, so you haven't proved yourself able to deal with the grant, so we're not going to give you a grant. It's the catch-22 at that point.
So we'll get to solutions in a second. One thing that I thought was really interesting, this is sort of confusing to a layman like myself, but I'm sure a lot of my audience, who sort of think of peer review as the check to bad science getting through. And one of the things you say in your paper is that that's not as true as maybe a lot of people think. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that? Because that's so counterintuitive to people who sort of have an undergrad understanding of science, of like, oh, science is just this like, great process of only discovering truth.
So let me be clear, like science is this great process, and it is like the best way to discover truth. But scientists are humans, and they've set up human institutions, and those institutions have all the kinds of flaws that all human institutions have. And, peer review, in theory, is, a scientist or a group of scientists, they do some work and they write it up and they say, this is what we did, this is what we found, and they send it out. And reviewers are other scientists in a similar field. And the idea is they read it and they check the methods and they make sure this makes sense, this is and this is done well, and we should publish this. Now, to some extent, that is what happens, but peer review is actually not very good at weeding out mistakes. It's very good at correcting things like, you've ignored this literature that's really important. It's really good at saying, here's an obvious logical error that you've made in, drawing a conclusion from your results. It's not, historically anyway, great at saying these methods appear to be flawed and not able to tell whether or not your result is we should believe it. And to some extent, it's what we talked about before, the fact that people were sending in papers and not fully describing their methods, not giving their data. And it used to be that, before the internet, it was hard to do that anyway, right? You'd send in and you'd say, basically, trust me, we did this right. We know how to do it. And it turns out peer review has just sort of not been historically set up to catch a lot of errors. I think peer review is still valuable, but there's, I got into a conversation with another scientist recently, where I was arguing that as soon as your study is ready, we should use what's called preprints. It was in favor of preprints, saying sort of not bypassing peer review, but saying put your papers up online before peer review and just let everyone see it, and then you can get sort of community peer review. And someone else said, well, that sounds well and good, but if something's not peer review, how do I know whether it's right? And I said, you have to read it. And also that's true if it is peer reviewed, you have to read it. Like, you can't trust the peer reviewers to tell you whether or not you should trust the conclusions of the paper. You actually have to look and evaluate it yourself. And that's what our jobs as scientists should be. Now, I get it, like the public doesn't have the time or the expertise necessarily to read every scientific paper and evaluate every claim they see in the head. I mean, to be honest, most scientists don't have the expertise to evaluate something that's not in their direct field. But that is all the more reason, for us to put a higher premium on rigor. And also, there's a responsibility for journalism in addition, but that's another story.
Oh yeah. I don't even want to get into that. That's a huge problem. The science says tagline just really gets me under the collar, actually. So let's talk a bit about let's talk a little bit about solutions, right? Because you have all these problems. You modeled. Look, if we have the current incentives we do, it's going to lead to a really high false positive rate, because these labs keep getting incentivized to just publish things with. And it's not so important whether they're reproducible. Number one, because reproducibility isn't that highly selected for, but it also doesn't carry that much prestige, and it may have a hard time getting published. So you find all these things, and you find that, like, okay, labs are, at least in this game theory way, they should sort of be just doing a bunch of, not shoddy, maybe a little bit shoddy work, I guess. What do we do, right? Because you still have the problem of we have to measure something. I mean, like, well, it feels like there's always the pressure to be measuring something. Like, are we measuring productivity, et cetera?
Yeah. So, I mean, and this is true of all industries, right? Hiring is an exercise in decision making under uncertainty, right? We're making decisions about who we should hire, who we should fund, who we should promote with limited information. We don't know everything about this person. And so, so proxies come up. And in our sort of current data-driven world, right, people are always like, the more, if I can have quantitative metrics, then we can do, we can streamline things, we can make them universal, we can have these are the standards. And this is a challenge because there are very good reasons for doing things like that, right? When you make things quantitative, it eliminates things like biases toward what you already know, what you're already comfortable with. It helps reduce things like gender bias and other kinds of discrimination. At the same time, it also allows proxies to select for things that maximize those metrics without maximizing the things the metrics are intending to measure. So what do we do? This is not an easy question. It's not easy, right? If there was an obvious and solution that I was certain about, I would have let you know, right? One of the things that I think is most important is for people to be aware of the problem, right? If we don't know that there's a problem, it's very hard to discuss solutions. So part of the effort that I'm involved in, but lots and lots of other people are, to sort of point out this kind of problem. And I feel like to some extent, this paper, the one that you mentioned, the Natural Selection of Bad Science, one of the things that it does is most importantly is just to point out that this is a problem. This is going on, that this is a dynamic that can happen. And it can happen even if individuals take steps to make sure that their work is good, right? It doesn't get you off the hook. It's good, I support it. Make your methods as good as possible, but it doesn't get you off the hook because the individuals who do, who have methods that allow them to game the system, maybe even unconsciously, right? One of the things that this kind of selection pressure can select for is misunderstandings, right? If the people who understand things perfectly well are the ones who are really worried and take their time and are really careful and get a lot of negative results, and the ones who misunderstand, use the wrong things and incorrectly think that they're doing a great job and get lots of positive results, and they get a lot of that gives them success, then we end up with selecting for misunderstanding.
I think that's such a huge,
but that's a possibility.
Right. I think that's so huge for people to understand, because I think a lot of people, what I'm afraid of is when people watch this, they're going to say, oh, well, just scientists need to do better. And I think what you're pointing out is that there are scientists, a lot of them, doing a great job. But when a system is selecting like this, those people end up getting phased out. The people who aren't paying attention to the incentives of the game, unfortunately, even though they're doing the right thing according to what we want in our idealistic sense of science, they're getting selected against, and ultimately they are not the ones who have all the attention on them, have all the funding, have all the grants and people under them, and so that is such a huge point.
Yeah. So this is the major concern, that this can happen. So what do? One of the things is we make sure that people are aware of this and they take it into account. And the other is that we work toward, institutional change. Institutional change is one of the hardest things in the world to do, right? It's a massive coordination problem.
100%. Yeah, there's so many different players that you sort of have to get all to agree and adopt whatever the new standard is. whether it be the modified funding lottery, et cetera.
Yeah, so I mean, so things like modified funding lotteries, and I'm sure other solutions that I'm not aware of or haven't thought of, or just didn't think of right now. These are kind of intermediate things. They involve coordination within institutions, but not necessarily across institutions. So changing norms across the entire sort of meta institution of academia is just really hard. There's the sort of famous line often attributed to Max Planck: "Science advances one funeral at a time." Right? It's very hard to get senior people to change their minds. It's not impossible, but it's hard. If we can, within an institution, though, sometimes people can be convinced and they can do things like, okay, we should set up, let's say, modified funding lotteries get set up and are widespread. There's probably going to be a bunch of problems with that we haven't foreseen, but that selects for rigor in a way that isn't around as much right now. There are other institutions that are also paying a lot of attention to this, and so we promote this, and maybe we get pockets, right? Maybe there are little pockets, some fields, some institutions, some universities, some countries that are more known for rigor than others. And then the question is, right, what happens then? What happens when you get one community that publishes a ton, but has a reputation for being not rigorous, and another population that publishes a lot, much less, and has a reputation for rigor? And if rigor is the thing that we care about, really, then maybe the methods of the rigor, if that happens, right, we can coalesce communities that are consistently more rigorous. Maybe this is idealistic, but maybe that's one way for that kind of behavior to spread. Sort of one community at a time.
And it seems obvious that we would select for rigor, which we sort of can define as less likely to be wrong about the finding.
Yeah, I'll say that we can define rigor by its outcome. Like, a rigorous study is one where the claim or the finding is most likely to be correct.
Right.
And there's always going to be some error, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the methodology that really matters in the end. Is if you did the methodology, if you got it right, you're less likely to be finding some sort of false positive.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of just to put this forward. There are really two components to reducing false positives. One is the methodology, and one is the hypothesis generation, where the hypotheses come from. Right. So if you're just coming up with crazy things, and you're just sort of like, this seems like it would be true, right? Let's just test it. Things that people without a lot of training or that don't think things through very much, like, let's just test any nutty idea I have. Most of those ideas are going to be wrong. And if you have enough noise, like if you're like, and I'm stealing this from XKCD, but if you're like, I believe there's a color of jelly bean that cures cancer, and I'm going to test every possible color of jelly bean in the universe over and over again, eventually you're going to come up with a positive result. Because
there's enough noise in the system.
There's enough noise in the system.
Something's going to be statistically significant.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's not just about reducing noise in having rigorous methods. It's also about improving the hypothesis generation. Because even if you have a tiny little bit of noise, if you consistently come up with things that are wrong, eventually one of those is just going to, by chance, come up with a positive result. And the better we are at coming up with hypotheses to begin with that are right, the less susceptible to that noise we're going to be. So it's really these two things together.
There's also the problem of harking, right, too. Like, you have your results, and then you're like, well, this sort of looks like this is what's happening here, so I'm going to go hypothesize that and then, write a paper about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think of that as a methodological aspect, but you're right. It's maybe a little bit of both. So yeah, harking, hypothesizing after results are known. Is like, let's say you test something and you're like, here are some things. What does that look like? Now that's actually not a terrible thing to try to find, like, that's what we do, right? We try to find patterns in noise.
Of course.
The problem is when it's sold as if it's what you thought was going to happen all the time. Right. So the problem really isn't hypothesizing after results are known. It's pretending that was your hypothesis before the results were known.
Yeah.
And that, so it presents it as if you were a lot more prescient, as if you had a much deeper understanding of the system than you really do. Hypothesizing after results are known, if you find a pattern in the data after you collect it that you didn't expect, that should be the seed for then more directed investigation, not, oh, and we found this and end of story.
One thing I sort of want you to explain, because again, I think there are a lot of misconceptions among people who know a little bit about science but never have actually done any work in the field themselves or have any experience. There's a lot of equating, and I think maybe with a little bit of good reason, because there probably is a correlation, but there's a lot of equating of good journals with great science, right? And I think maybe people don't understand the incentives that are not directly quality related that go into getting into a good journal. And I'd love for you to talk about that.
Yeah. This is an issue. And it's like anything else, right? The measure becomes the target. So people have limited attention spans, right? We can't read everything. We can't look at everything, and so if we're going to look at just a few things, it's often we're going to check, most scientists are going to check the things in their field, and then the big interdisciplinary journals. Because of that, these big interdisciplinary journals and other reasons get a lot of eyes. And they also have very, things like journals like specialty journals are run by working scientists who have other things going on in their lives. Journals like Nature and Science are run by professional editors, and their full-time salary job is editing that journal. And they have dedicated press staff, right, that are tapped into. So if you have a study that you think is important, a great way to get attention is to publish it in Nature, not just because people read Nature, but also because Nature has a press office that communicates directly with the press. And because of that, and because journals like Nature and Science are journals that are, that make a profit, right, or they make money, and they have to hire staff and they have to sell issues, that means that they really need to get those clicks. And so, one thing that if I was, the editor of a top specialty journal in a narrow field, and I got a study, the real question is like, is this, okay, is this important? And is this right? These are the two questions. Is this important and is this right? There's nothing wrong with that per se. But what if you say, how likely is it that such and such a claim is right, given the potential importance if it is right?
Yeah.
So if this were right, how important would it be? Now, as soon as you start asking that question, there ends up being the potential to decouple quality and newsworthiness.
And to be clear, this is the problem that Nature and Science face, because they need clicks, and so they're thinking about how would a lay audience think about this in terms of importance? How would the press think about this in terms of importance?
Absolutely right. Yeah. And so the question is, given a certain level of potential newsworthiness, how rigorous does it have to be to pass muster?
Yeah.
Right? And if these things are correlated, then what you can end up getting is that the most newsworthy things are the least likely to be true.
Right. Because the most newsworthy things are the ones that are most likely to pass muster, no matter the likelihood of being true.
And this is also true even if this doesn't occur, because if you're selecting on newsworthiness, just newsworthiness, right? What's newsworthy? Things that are surprising.
And things that are surprising are often not true.
Right. And things that are surprising are the most likely to be wrong, right? If you were like, a new study shows that when you drop things, they fall down, right? No one would publish that because obviously that's the case, right? But if it's like, new study shows that dinosaurs and cats coexisted, that would be amazing. And right? And like, think of the memes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's no way that's true, right? And extraordinary claims really should demand extraordinary evidence.
But
But
that's
if
not the
you're worried
case.
about news coverage, then you were, well, if there's some chance that it's true, then maybe we publish it and we take a chance.
Right. Right.
It's hard because it comes back to scientists are human beings and we have human concerns, and I think scientists, and I'm biased because I am one, but I love talking to scientists, and I feel really privileged to be a scientist and get to spend time working with scientists, because I think that they're really people in general with very high integrity who are really interested in the world and interested in exploring deep questions about the world. But at the end of the day, we also are human beings with human concerns.
Yep. Yep. So in other words, these journals are not a mere direct, they don't have a direct relationship, in other words, with robustness, is what you're saying.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I think that
not that they aren't robust, but
Yeah.
that they have other selection methods as well.
Yeah.
They have other things they're also
the editors of all these journals all have scientific training, and they are aware of at least some of these problems, and they are doing what they think is the best job they can do, and they are taking efforts to check things. They're sending their papers out for review. They're trying their best to make sure that claims are not wrong, but they're also humans, and they're subject to selection pressures and incentives that are not only related to rigor.
Right. And really, this not only means that if you're a scientist trying to get into nature and science, you might have to change what you're looking for, because instead of looking for, doing just basic research that nobody in the press is going to be interested in, you may want to do something that would be seen as landmark. If you might pick hypotheses based on, whether this is going to get into nature or, science or anything like that.
Yeah. So this actually happened to me. When I'm not going to name names, but I was a postdoc at one point. I did a few postdocs, but at one point in one of the other postdocs, we had been talking about, the job market's pretty tough out there. And he came into my office one day and he said, let's try to think of a study that we could do that it would be the kind of study that would get into Nature. Because if we can get a Nature paper, that'll really help us get a job. And I thought, wait, we're coming up with the study based on whether or not it's going to, and I just said no. But, I'm sure that conversation happens all the time.
Oh, I'm sure. It's a bit like people I'm shocked at the relationship between I think you guys have a lot more integrity than we do, but like in YouTube, you'd sort of hear a similar conversation going on. How can we make a viral video? Like, how can I make the big thing? Instead of it being just about, making the thing you want to make, then it just becomes, as you said, just seeking the metric that people are rating you by.
And it's hard because these things are also not separate, right? Like, you want to get a viral video in part because that's how you get success and that enables you to do the thing you want to do, right? We want to get jobs as scientists because we love being scientists and doing this work, and we need these jobs and these grants to do the stuff we need to do. But sometimes, these are incentives that select for different kinds of behavior, right? If you're shaping your behavior and the kinds of work you're doing, that's going to be more likely to lead you to a Nature paper, or to get funded by some particular agency. On the one hand, you could argue, well, maybe that's good because the incentives are, these are the journals that are publishing the most important work. So if you're likely to get published in Nature, that means that you're probably doing more important work than someone who's never publishing in Nature. On the other hand, right, importance is very hard to assess. Surprise easy.
Right. We were talking about before the show. We were talking about Peter Higgs, who I'm putting in the show. How really, if it hadn't been for his Nobel Prize, I mean, if you looked at him as a scientist according to just like every other thing he had done, a lot of people would have sort of thrown him aside, and that's what he said. If I was doing science now, I wouldn't be hired. And this is sort of the problem with just measuring people by their number of publications or by their, like if you got in Nature or Science or not. Oftentimes, I don't know how to say it. I don't know if oftentimes is the right word, but as you say, these proxies are imperfect, and we can end up leaving a lot of really good scientists at the door, and maybe scientists who are doing the most rigorous work, who are doing the kinds of things that don't select for just a ton of papers all the time.
Yeah. I mean, I think you said it perfectly there. Peter Higgs is a great example. He's just a sort of the most extreme example. But yeah, I'm sure there's lots of people who are doing really interesting, really rigorous work. And to do deep work also requires some removal, right? If you want to do really deep, interesting, unique work, right? And this is true of any field, not just science, but art and, literature, anything that involves creation, right? The people who are going to be doing the things that are the most unique and potentially groundbreaking are probably not the people who are always moving and hustling and, in the limelight. It's going to be people who at least sometimes take time and go away for a while and work in a concentrated way on what they're doing. And if you never have the time and the space to do that, if the people who need the time and the space to do that are never given the opportunity to do that, what does that mean for the landscape of research? The kinds of research that we see and that gets done. It's not obvious how to solve this problem, but I think it's an important thing to consider.
Perfect. That was very well said. That's probably going to be the closing remarks. That was perfect. I mean, you absolutely nailed it. Wow, I feel really honored. I really appreciate you taking the time.
No, thank you. It was a pleasure.